Stephen Colbert sat alone in his dressing room at CBS. But this wasn't the confident late-night host America knows. His hands trembled slightly as he closed a worn leather journal, pages filled with handwritten prayers and scripture verses. The familiar sound of his production team preparing for another night of political satire echoed through the hallway. But Stephen's mind was elsewhere, wrestling with a secret he'd kept hidden for 3 decades of his career. When his assistant knocked to announce that Jonathan Roumie had arrived for their private meeting, Stephen quickly slipped the journal into his desk drawer. "Send him in," he said, his voice carrying an unusual gravity that would have surprised his millions of viewers. Jonathan entered expecting the witty, irreverent comedian he'd watched for years, but instead found a man whose expression held the weight of someone preparing to confess something profound. "Mr. Roumie," Stephen began, rising from his chair with an intensity rarely seen outside his most serious interviews. "I asked you here tonight because what I'm about to share will shock people who think they know me. For 30 years, I've made a living making people laugh at politics, culture, and yes, sometimes faith itself. But 3 months ago, something you did in The Chosen changed everything I thought I knew about Jesus, about comedy, and about the lie I've been living." Jonathan shifted forward, sensing this wasn't going to be the casual celebrity meeting he'd anticipated. Stephen continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "What I discovered about Christ's true message, and how I've been betraying it on national television every single night, broke something inside me that I didn't even know was broken. And tonight, for the first time in my career, I'm going to tell the truth about what it really costs to follow Jesus in Hollywood." The studio lights seemed different somehow as Stephen looked directly at Jonathan, his usual comedic mask completely gone. "What I'm about to share with you will end my career as America knows it. But staying silent would be an even greater betrayal of everything he taught us." Jonathan realized this wasn't going to be an interview about faith and entertainment. This was going to be a confession that would shake the very foundations of how Stephen Colbert was perceived by the world, and the revelation that was coming would change everything. The walk from Stephen's dressing room to the studio felt different than any other night in his 15-year late-night career. Jonathan walked beside him, still processing the weight of what Stephen had just revealed in private, while crew members bustled around them preparing for what they thought would be a standard faith-based interview segment. But Stephen knew better. Tonight would be the night he either destroyed everything he'd built or finally became the man his faith demanded him to be. "You realize," Jonathan said quietly as they approached the studio entrance, "that once you say this publicly, there's no taking it back." Stephen paused, his hand on the door handle, and for a moment, Jonathan saw the full weight of what was about to happen reflected in the comedian's eyes. "I've spent 3 decades perfecting the art of saying everything except what matters most," Stephen replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "If I don't speak this truth tonight, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I chose my career over Christ when it mattered most." The studio audience was already seated, expecting their usual dose of political humor and celebrity banter, completely unaware they were about to witness something unprecedented in television history. Stephen's producers had no idea what he was planning. They thought this was simply a conversation about faith and entertainment. But as Stephen looked out at the cameras preparing to go live, he knew that everything he was about to say would put his reputation, his career, and his entire public identity on the line. "Ladies and gentlemen," the floor director announced, "we're live in 60 seconds. Stephen turned to Jonathan one final time. "What I'm about to reveal will shock my audience, horrify my network executives, and probably end my show," he said, with a strange peace in his voice. "But for the first time in 30 years, I'm going to tell America what Jesus actually demands of those who claim to follow him, and how I've been a coward and a hypocrite for pretending comedy could be neutral ground." The red light blinked on. They were live, and there was no turning back from the truth that was about to shatter Stephen Colbert's carefully constructed public persona forever. The studio lights felt harsher than usual as Stephen faced the cameras, knowing that millions of viewers were expecting their regular dose of late-night comedy, not the spiritual reckoning he was about to unleash. "Jonathan," Stephen began, his voice carrying none of its usual theatrical energy. "3 months ago, I was in my office writing jokes about evangelical politicians when your portrayal of Jesus clearing the temple came on my monitor." He paused, the weight of the confession already visible on his face. "I was crafting punchlines about religious hypocrisy while watching you embody the very Christ I claim to follow. And something inside me snapped." Jonathan leaned forward, sensing the depth of what was coming. Stephen continued, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "For 30 years, I've been living a double life that would make any politician proud. By day, I attend Mass, pray the Rosary, and consider myself a faithful Catholic. By night, I stand on this stage and mock the very faith that claims to define me." The audience, expecting laughter, sat in confused silence as Stephen's voice grew more intense. "I realized I've been using comedy as a shield, not just against political criticism, but against the radical demands of actually following Christ. When Jesus said, 'Take up your cross daily,' he wasn't talking about wearing a crucifix. He was talking about dying to everything that makes us comfortable, including our careers." Stephen's voice cracked slightly as he continued, "I've spent decades telling myself that comedy was neutral territory, that I could separate my faith from my profession. But watching you portray Jesus' righteous anger in the temple, I saw him overturning tables while I was sitting safely behind my desk, making jokes about the very people he was confronting. The confession poured out of him like water through a broken dam. Every night, I walk onto this stage, knowing that the Jesus I worship on Sunday would not recognize the man who hides behind punchlines Monday through Friday. I've convinced myself that making people laugh at politicians is somehow different from making them laugh at faith itself. But Jesus doesn't draw those convenient lines." Jonathan watched as one of America's most beloved comedians dismantled his own carefully constructed public image with surgical precision. "The most devastating realization," Stephen said, his voice now barely above a whisper, "was understanding that I've been exactly like the religious leaders Jesus condemned, teaching one thing while living another, using my position to avoid the very transformation I claim to believe in." Jonathan took a deep breath, recognizing that Stephen's vulnerability demanded an equally honest response. "Stephen," he began slowly, "what you're describing cuts to the heart of something I've wrestled with every single day since I first put on that robe." The studio remained unusually quiet as Jonathan continued. "When I was cast as Jesus, I thought I understood what I was getting into. I'd been a practicing Catholic my whole life. I knew the stories. I'd even done my research." He paused, meeting Stephen's intense gaze. "But nothing prepared me for what happens when you spend 14 hours a day trying to embody the character of Christ." Stephen nodded, sensing a kindred struggle in Jonathan's words. Jonathan continued, his voice gaining emotional weight. "The first major scene I filmed was Jesus calling the disciples. I had to look these actors in the eye and say, 'Follow me,' with the same authority that convinced fishermen to abandon their nets. That night in my hotel room, I broke down because I realized I was speaking words I didn't have the courage to live myself." The confession seemed to unlock something in both men as Stephen leaned forward. "Exactly," Stephen said with surprising intensity. "You're portraying perfect love while knowing your own heart intimately. I'm making jokes about imperfect faith while being the most imperfect believer in the room." Jonathan's eyes glistened as he shared more. "There's a scene where Jesus sits with children, and he tells the disciples that heaven belongs to such as these. We filmed it 17 times, and each take revealed another layer of my own spiritual pride." His voice broke slightly. "I called my mother that night, sobbing, because I realized that playing Jesus was destroying every comfortable assumption I'd made about following him. Stephen's usual composure cracked as he responded, "That's the terror I've been avoiding for 30 years. Comedy lets me observe faith from a safe distance, analyzing and commenting without ever having to be transformed by it." The two men sat in a moment of profound recognition. "The hardest part," Jonathan continued, "isn't memorizing scripture or nailing the dramatic moments. It's going home every night knowing that the Jesus I portrayed today demands everything from the Jonathan who will wake up tomorrow." Stephen's eyes filled with tears as he realized he wasn't alone in his struggle. "We're both performers, struggling with the same impossible standard," he said quietly. "The difference is, your performance points people toward truth, while mine has been hiding from it." Stephen wiped his eyes and straightened in his chair, a new determination replacing his earlier vulnerability. "Jonathan, there's something else I need to confess that goes deeper than just my personal hypocrisy," he said, his voice taking on the prophetic intensity usually reserved for his most serious monologues. "I've come to realize that comedy isn't neutral. It's one of the most powerful weapons for shaping how people think about truth itself." Jonathan listened intently as Stephen continued. "For years, I convinced myself that making people laugh at religious politicians was somehow serving justice. But I've been blind to how my jokes have been training an entire generation to see faith itself as inherently ridiculous." The weight of this admission hung heavy in the studio air. Stephen's voice grew more passionate. Jesus used parables, stories that revealed truth through unexpected angles. I've been using punchlines that obscure truth through cynical deflection. There's a massive difference between humor that illuminates and humor that destroys, and I've been on the wrong side of that line for decades. He stood up, pacing with the energy that made him famous, but now directed toward a different purpose. The prophets in Scripture often used humor, irony, and satire to expose hypocrisy and point people toward God. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether my comedy was pointing people toward truth or away from it. Jonathan nodded, recognizing the spiritual wrestling in Stephen's words. "When you portray Jesus confronting the Pharisees," Stephen continued, "there's often this knowing look in your eyes, like he sees the absurdity of their performance while loving them through it. That's divine comedy, humor that exposes falsehood while offering redemption." Stephen's voice cracked with emotion. "But I've been practicing a different kind of comedy, one that exposes falsehood while offering only more cynicism. I've been making people laugh at the very thing that could save them." The confession poured out faster now. "Every night I stand on this stage with the power to shape how millions of people think about faith, truth, and meaning. And instead of using that platform to point them toward the transformative love of Christ, I've been teaching them that skepticism is safer than belief, that doubt is more sophisticated than faith." Stephen sat back down, his usual comedic energy now channeled into prophetic conviction. "The most damning realization is that I've been exactly like the court jesters of old, speaking truth to power while being completely owned by the very system I pretend to critique. My jokes about religious hypocrisy have become their own form of hypocrisy, and tonight that ends." Stephen paused, gathering himself for what would be the most vulnerable moment of his public life. The studio had fallen into a profound silence, sensing that something extraordinary was building. "Jonathan," he began, his voice trembling with an intensity that seemed to surprise even himself, "there's one more thing I need to tell you, and it's going to sound impossible." Jonathan leaned forward, completely absorbed in Stephen's raw honesty. "Last week, I was watching your portrayal of Jesus, telling the parable of the prodigal son for the third time, trying to find material for a bit about political comebacks." Stephen continued, his hands shaking slightly. "But when you delivered the line about the father running toward his wayward son, something happened that I've never experienced in 30 years of television." The camera captured every nuance of Stephen's face as he struggled to find words. I saw Jesus' face break into this knowing smile, not condescending, but full of this cosmic understanding, like he was seeing the divine joke that we're all desperately trying to earn love we already have. Stephen's voice began to crack. And in that moment, I realized that the Jesus you portray has been laughing with me, not at me, through every moment of my doubt. Every night I've hidden behind jokes instead of facing truth. Every time I've chosen comfort over courage. Tears began streaming down Stephen's face as he continued. He's been the patient father, watching his prodigal son perform for applause, while missing the feast that was always waiting at home. And I realized I've spent my entire career making people laugh while being afraid to let them see the Jesus who makes me weep with gratitude. Jonathan's own composure completely shattered as he watched one of America's most guarded public figures break open with spiritual recognition. "Stephen," Jonathan managed through his own tears, "what you just described, that smile, that cosmic understanding, that's exactly what I feel when I'm portraying him. Like he sees the beautiful absurdity of how hard we work to earn what's already ours." Both men were now crying freely. The usual boundaries of television professionalism completely dissolved. "The divine comedy," Stephen whispered through his tears, "isn't that faith is ridiculous. It's that we make it so complicated when it's actually the simplest thing in the world." The studio crew stood transfixed as they witnessed two successful entertainers being completely undone by a truth that transcended their professional personas. For the first time in his career, Stephen Colbert had stopped performing entirely and had become fully, authentically human on national television. As the tears slowly subsided, both men sat in the profound stillness that follows moments of genuine transformation. Stephen wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, no longer the polished television host, but simply a man who had finally told the truth. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said, his voice hoarse but oddly peaceful. "For the first time in decades, I'm not afraid of what happens next." Jonathan nodded, understanding completely. "Because you finally stopped performing and started being," he replied softly. Stephen looked directly into the camera, addressing his audience with a vulnerability they had never seen. "For 30 years, you've invited me into your homes every night, and I've repaid that trust by hiding the most important part of who I am. Tonight, that changes." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I don't know if CBS will let me keep my job after this. I don't know if my audience will forgive me for years of spiritual cowardice disguised as comedy. But I do know that I can't go back to using laughter as a shield against the very truth that could heal our broken world." Jonathan watched as Stephen seemed to grow into a new version of himself before their eyes. "What I'm proposing isn't the end of comedy," Stephen continued, "but the beginning of a different kind of humor, one that points toward hope instead of despair, toward connection instead of division, toward the kind of love that's so radical it looks like divine comedy to a world that's forgotten how to laugh with joy instead of cynicism." The studio remained mesmerized as Stephen painted his vision. Imagine comedy that doesn't mock people's deepest beliefs, but reveals the beauty hidden within them. Imagine humor that doesn't tear down, but builds up, that doesn't divide, but unites us in our shared humanity. He turned back to Jonathan. "You've shown me that it's possible to perform truth instead of hiding from it. Maybe it's time for entertainment to remember that our highest calling isn't just to make people laugh, but to make them hope." Stephen's final words carried the weight of a man who had found his true purpose. Jesus said he came that we might have life abundantly. Maybe the bridge our culture needs isn't more sophisticated skepticism, but the courage to laugh with genuine joy again. The kind of laughter that comes from knowing we're beloved beyond measure, even in our brokenness. As the cameras prepared to fade, Stephen extended his hand to Jonathan. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me that the greatest performance of all is when we stop performing and start becoming who we were always meant to be." The red lights dimmed, but Stephen Colbert had never been more illuminated.